everyone. My name is Michaela Schuster, and today I will be discussing the relationship between law enforcement and the victims of law enforcement. There are a lot of names in this presentation, so hopefully I pronounce them correctly. If not, I do apologize ahead of time. There's a content warning to this presentation. I do want to stress that this presentation contains the following topics that may be uncomfortable or disturbing. Topics include victims of law enforcement and the George Floyd case with the knee placement picture that's going to be shown. Other topics that will be touched on but not go in depth are the words RAPE and domestic violence. If these topics make you feel uncomfortable throughout this presentation, you can mute the section or skip portions of the video. I will start out this presentation by discussing the history of victims in law enforcement. Victimology is a branch in criminology that scientifically studies the relationship between an injured party and an offender by examining the causes and the nature of the consequent suffering. This term first emerged in the 1940s and 50s when several criminologists, notably named Hans van Etting, Benjamin Mendelssohn, and Henry Ellenberg, examined victim-offender interactions and stressed reciprocal influences and role reversals. Victimology arose in Europe after World War II, primarily to seek to understand the criminal-victim relationship. Early victimology theory said that victim attitudes and conduct are among the causes of criminal behavior. In 1972, 3 pioneering victim assistance programs emerged: Aid for Victims of Crime in St. Louis Bay Area Women Against Rape in San Francisco, and the Rape Crisis Center in Washington, D.C. A highly publicized case of a victim of law enforcement that gained media attention and impacted the criminal justice system was the George Floyd case. On May 25th, 46-year-old George Floyd was arrested in the city of Minneapolis for allegedly using counterfeit money to buy a pack of cigarettes. The video of Floyd's death, where a police officer, Derek Chauvin, who was 44 years old at the time, knelt on his neck for 9 minutes while George pleaded that he could not breathe. This sparked widespread protests and demonstrations across the United States and globally, highlighting concerns about police brutality and systematic racism, leading to calls for criminal justice reform, including changes in police training, use of force policies, and accountability measures. The police officers who were involved in George Floyd's killing were either convicted or pleaded guilty to both federal and state charges, with, of course, Derek Chauvin, who was the officer who placed his knee on Floyd's neck. He has been dismissed from the police department and charged with murder. In April 2021, 11 months after Floyd's death, Chauvin had his trial. His trial demonstrated that police officers can be held accountable for their actions. Derek Chauvin is now serving 22.5 years in prison. He also received a 21-year federal sentence for violating Floyd's right. Chauvin was ordered to serve those sentences concurrently. The 3 other officers were charged with abetting the crime. J. Alexander Kueng received 3 years, To Tao received 3.5 years, and Thomas Lane received 2.5 years. In November of 2023, Chauvin appealed the murder convictions in hope of overturning the jury's verdict or reducing his sentencing. That appeal was rejected by the U.S. Supreme Court. Chauvin was also seeking to overturn his federal civil rights conviction, which was also overturned. Earlier this month, he filed a motion arguing that there was new evidence to suggest he did not cause Floyd's death. About 1 week to 2 weeks after his appeal, Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis police officer, was seriously injured on Friday after another inmate stabbed him inside a federal prison in Arizona, but was in stable condition after the incident. As a result of this horrific case, a push of change was needed. The George Floyd Justice in Policing Act was first introduced in 2020. This act aimed at holding police accountable for misconduct, improving transparency, and reforming police training and policies. While the bill was passed in the House in 2020, it failed to move into the Senate. The bill takes on the hard task of reforming 18,000 different police jurisdictions and contains several important provisions, including a ban on racial and religious profiling in policing, a misconduct registry for police officers so they are dismissed and not rehired in another jurisdiction, and bans the use of chokeholds, which was used in George Floyd's case, which killed him. The legal ramifications of law enforcement actions on victims encompass both the rights afforded to victims within the criminal justice system and the potential resources available when law enforcement misconduct occurs, including potential lawsuits under Section 1983. Section 1983 lawsuit governed by 42 U.S.C. and 1983 is a civil action that permits victims to seek money damages for their injuries. The lawsuit is meant to deter police misconduct and encourage departments to provide robust training for officers. A person might file a Section 1983 lawsuit in a case involving excessive use of force, unlawful arrest, or racial profiling, for example. Unfortunately, victims face a sometimes impossible hurdle called qualified immunity. Qualified immunity lets officers off the hook for civil liability unless the officer violated a clearly established right. The doctrine of qualified immunity is meant to protect officers from liability when they must make quick decisions that are reasonable but end up being flawed. But critics argue that it's nearly impossible for victims to meet the standard, and as a result, qualified immunity provides an absolute shield for officers' misconduct. Some examples of victims' rights and protections are the Victim Right Act, Marsy's Law, crime victim compensation, protection from intimidation and harassment, right to privacy, right to restitution, and right to a speedy trial. The Law Enforcement Ethics Code requires adherence for those individuals upholding the law. However, when law enforcement don't uphold their ethics and moral values or codes, the public loses trust and, most importantly, safety. The public perception of law enforcement actions involving illegal or unethical offenses is often marked by distrust and a sense of lack of accountability, particularly among minority groups, leading to calls for reform and increased oversight. Public trust in law enforcement is generally lower than trust in other professions, such as nursing. A significant portion of Americans believe police are not held accountable for misconduct. Minority groups, particularly African Americans, often report higher levels of distrust and suspicion towards law enforcement. Police misconduct can erode public trust and lead to a perception of police illegitimacy. Forms of police misconduct include corruption, which could be bribery or theft, abuse of authority, racial profiling, and brutality. Selective enforcement of laws and perjury are also forms of misconduct. Internal corruption, where officers break their potential contract and abuse their power for personal gain, is a serious challenge to public trust. Consequences of police misconduct can lead to public dissatisfaction with law enforcement and government. It can also increase the likelihood of supporting anti-governmental groups seeking alternative security measures. Transparency International Global Corruption Barometer consistently indicates that the police are perceived as one of the most corrupt institutions in many developing countries. Factors including public perception or the fairness of police procedures can improve public attitudes towards law enforcement and compliance. Community policing, where officers actively engage with residents, can also improve public perception. Racial disparities in policing and police violence are rooted in systematic exclusion and discrimination, and fueled by implicit and explicit bias. Efforts to improve police accountability and transparency, enhance police oversight, and accountability must focus on civilian control over the police, increasing public confidence and reducing corruption. Police reform initiatives include commissions of inquiry, meritocratic recruitment, and pay reform. The creation of independent anti-corruption agencies and international inspectors can also strengthen accountability. Before we discuss what should happen to leaders who commit misconduct, let's identify what leadership is. A leadership in the law enforcement workforce must have accountability, create a culture of accountability to others, face consequences for their actions, promote ethical leadership as an example to their subordinates, address systematic issues, show the importance of transparency, and have open communication. Leaderships who are responsible for law enforcement staff committing misconduct should be held accountable through internal investigations, potentially facing disciplinary action, demotion, criminal charges, or even termination, depending on the severity of the misconduct and their role enabling it. In today's modern media coverage, social media, mainstream news outlets, and television entertainment play pivotal roles in shaping public perception of crime. Such media representations can significantly sway public views on the prevalence, nature, and severity of crime in their local communities and at national level. These representations can also shape opinions about the fairness of the criminal justice system and the need for reform. Each media reference above has a unique role in the public perception of crime. However, combined, they undoubtedly reinforce the public perception that criminal activity is a more significant and immediate threat in the United States than is justified by publicly available crime data. For example, certain crimes that are overreported on social media platforms like Facebook, specifically crimes involving Black suspects, tend to be more prominent and shared more frequently on those platforms, creating a skewed view of race and crime. A recent study by the Stanford Law School shows that Black suspects are described in 32% of crime-related posts on social media, but represent only 20% of arrests in the United States. A policy to reduce victimization in law enforcement should focus on preventing, detecting, and responding to all forms of sexual abuse and harassment within law enforcement facilities, including holding cells and other detention areas. It also requires in cooperation, victim-centered, trauma-informed practices, and building partnerships with local trauma specialists and community-based organizations. Additionally, agencies should provide comprehensive training for officers, including empathy training and addressing the specific needs of their communities. There are many policies that were created to reduce victims in law enforcement. I mentioned some already, but here are more that I didn't mention. The Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, the International Association of Chiefs of Office, the United States Department of Justice, DOJ, the Law Enforcement-Based Direct Victim Services Program. DOJ then in 2022 updated the guidance and released it with the title Improving Law Enforcement Response to Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence by Identifying and Preventing Gender Bias. Correctional officer-inmate relationships pose significant ethical and legal problems due to the inherent power imbalance and the potential for exploitation. Ethically, these relationships violate the principles of professionalism, trust, respect, and it can undermine the correctional system's integrity. Legally, such relationships can lead to criminal charges such as sexual abuse and potentially violate inmate rights under the Prison Rape Elimination Act. Inappropriate relationships between correctional officers and inmates in U.S. prisons pose significant challenges, limiting institutional security and safety, potentially leading to staff misconduct and undermining the rehabilitation process. These relationships can create opportunities for contraband smuggling, violence, and even escapes, further impacting the well being of both inmates and officers. Thank you for taking the time and listening to my presentation on the relationship between law enforcement and victims. I really learned a lot from doing this presentation, and I really hope you guys learned something new from my presentation and enjoyed it.